Sago everyone. So here are the slides for week 5, and we're jumping off of last week's topic on early treaties to talk about modern treaties in Canada. So I want to preface this by talking about UNDRIP, which stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and this is something that's fairly recent in history. It was adopted in 2007. Indigenous people from around the world worked on this for over 2 decades before it finally got adopted. Okay, and when it first came out, and the different nations that are part of the UN were asked to sign, 4 nations originally refused to sign it. Can you guess which ones? I'll give you a minute. Guess. Come on, give it a shot. What 4 nations in the world originally refused to sign a document, an international document that would recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples? And why would they refuse? Well, guess what? Canada was one of these 4 nations, as was the US, New Zealand, and Australia, and these 4 nations are among the worst in terms of respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. Now, they're not the only ones. Obviously, this nonsense has been going on all over the world, but they're very renowned for it. So just to give you an example of what's in this document, this is from Article 10 on page 11 of the Declaration. Indigenous peoples shall not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. No relocation shall take place without a free, prior, and informed consent of the Indigenous peoples concerned, and after agreement on just and fair compensation, and, where possible, with the option of return. You'll note here that this contradicts what I keep harping on. They're not capitalizing Indigenous all the way through. In 2007, that wasn't yet the norm. That norm is growing now, especially in journalism and academia. So I'm not lying. It's just this is from 2007. Okay. Article 28.1 on page 20, and by the way, this links to, if you're looking at the slides on your own later on, this links to the Declaration. Indigenous peoples have the right to redress by means that can include restitution, or, when this is not possible, just, fair, and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used, and which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. Now, I picked those two out because of this idea here, free, prior, and informed consent, and this discussion that, Indigenous peoples should, their rights to access lands that their ancestors have occupied for millennia and that have often been stolen from them, effectively, that they should, have free, prior, and informed consent before further land grabs, and they should also be able to reoccupy these stolen lands. Now, Canada objected because they didn't like this free, prior, and informed consent thing. They were saying, and people still say this, Legault has said this, right? And here in Quebec, and Trudeau says nice things, but he still kind of doesn't really respect this either. And at the time this came through with Stephen Harper, so the Conservative government. So they don't like this idea of free, prior, and informed consent because they're saying, well, every time we want to, develop an area economically, then the local Indigenous population will be allowed to stand against us, which is as it should be, but the government doesn't agree with that. So let's look at the history behind this objection. Where does this come from? So some of you have already begun to realize that this story of Canada the Great, that maybe your parents and grandparents were taught when your family first came to Canada, or that, people have been raised here in elementary and high school history to learn. It's not quite accurate. So let's go back in time a little bit, and we're going to do that by looking at these concepts. I know it's confusing. Usually the anthro concepts are at the end of the slides. Now they're here because we need these concepts for this week to understand the material a little bit better. So there are more than 2 forms of colonialism, but for our purpose here, we can talk about 2 main ones. One of them is exploitation colonialism, and it's mostly economic in nature. So this is what was going on early during colonization of, Turtle Island, or what you now know as North America. So it's about gaining raw materials, sometimes in the form of labor, sometimes, through actual resources, natural resources, to benefit the colonial powers. So England and France, in our case. Okay, and so examples of this: the fur trade, right? You might remember this from history, where kind of the foundation of Canada as we know it today is largely rooted in the fur trade. Also, the slave trade has played a role, and any other kind of incidents where you have a colonial nation going in somewhere and not really sticking around, just staying around long enough to kind of take everything they can for the benefit of the homeland. Then there's settler colonialism, where you have dominance by colonial powers, again, such as England and France, with the goal to replace or displace indigenous populations for settlement of people from the colonial homelands. So that's different than exploitation. They can both happen together, right? But then after a while, what's happened here in what we now know as Canada is that settler colonialism came to replace exploitation colonialism, because you had more and more settlers from England and France in particular coming over, they started kind of in the 1600s, 1700s, but that increased later on as we get closer to the creation of Canada as a nation that kind of distances itself a little bit from the colonial homelands. Not as much as the US did, but still kind of formed their own country. And this was only made possible by, moving people out of the way, moving indigenous people out of the way, to get more space for settlers. So this is very relevant when we talk about more modern treaties, because it has everything to do with some of the phrasing that Vowell discusses in her chapter, for example. So here we can even start, though, at the pre-Confederate time, so before Canada actually became a country. So after the 1800s, and like late 1800s is when Canada became created, right? So Confederation of Canada. So obviously colonialism started before that, and before this time, again, 1500s, 1600s, you're seeing a lot of exploitation colonialism, and then over time it starts to shift, right? Because there's this increase in settler colonialism at this point onward, and more and more settlers are coming, and the colonial powers that were controlling what was to be Canada, and later on Canada itself, when it became a nation, wanted to make more room. So a lot of treaties from that period onward were explicitly aimed at getting indigenous people to surrender their land. Now, if you recall from last week, we talked about, friendship, peace and friendship treaties. Mostly it was centered around economic alliances and military alliances, right? So it wasn't so much about giving up land. And we saw towards the end of that chapter last week that, they were starting to talk about that a little bit towards the end. And here it's becoming more about that, the colonial nations didn't need indigenous people anymore at this point as military allies or economic allies. They just wanted to get them out of the way. So, and then Vowell talks about these different kind of treaties. So again, remember, Canada, as we know it today, didn't always have these same boundaries, right? So if you go back to your history notes from the history of Canada in high school, you see it changed over time, right? And these treaties had something to do with that. And John Burroughs, who we've mentioned before, talks about this quite a bit. And so Chelsea Vowell talks about these different kinds of treaties, and you can see a map on page 255 of what are called numbered treaties, sometimes referred to as historic treaties. And this is going to become relevant to kind of have read up on what those treaties are when you watch the film for this week, okay? So sometimes you might hear people, if you start going to events, you might hear people, especially from out west, because these treaties that are mentioned, a lot of them were from out west through, parts of what are now known as Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and people will say, I'm from, Treaty 4 territory, right? And by saying this, they're rooting themselves in a place where there was actually an agreement with the federal government, but it didn't necessarily as we saw, the interpretation of these treaties wasn't the same on behalf of settler nations and indigenous peoples, right? So what we said last week about them being interpreted differently, that was still the case here, and you're going to learn more about that when you watch the film, because they actually talk about this very explicitly in terms of like some of the lies that were involved in getting indigenous people to sign these treaties. So what's on paper isn't always what was told to people. Okay, so for a lot of these treaties here, like numbered treaties, they would write a bunch of things and they would show up somewhere and get people to agree to it. Just they wouldn't necessarily have adequate translation. Sometimes they would overtly lie and say things like, oh yeah, you're still going to get to hunt and do everything you've always done. It's fine. There's no problem here. It's just about sharing the land. And indigenous peoples, as we've seen, were pretty much okay with sharing the land. But what they weren't told what was actually written, and you'll learn more about these clauses sometimes that were in there about giving up land. There were other things too that aren't discussed in the textbook or the film, but sometimes they would actually, go to communities where, people lived in an egalitarian way and they didn't have these formal chiefs that were allowed to speak for everybody. But the European colonizers would come and just say, hey, you're the chief now and you're representing your people. And they would sometimes get them drunk or just give them stuff to kind of help them feel powerful and manipulate them into signing. So it's pretty horrible stuff. So in addition to that, of course, as we've discussed before, there's the whole kind of thing about written versus oral agreements. We kind of, finished off on that last week, where today there's more acknowledgement about the validity of some old oral agreements, but, the written word still kind of rules in Canada overall. And the interpretation of kind of more recent treaties, the differences in interpretation based on worldview, again, it's a similar thing, because there's that whole idea of, the European-based mindset, the settler mindset of a treaty, you sign it and it's static and it never changes, and that's it, right? We've done it, we've agreed, you signed, we're done. Whereas in indigenous worldviews, their treaties are relationships, as we saw last week, so they're always evolving as people's needs changed, and you have to keep kind of replenishing that relationship, keep polishing that chain, keep, gift giving and exchange and just discussion to kind of see where people are at. So very different, and that continues today. So if we look at Vowels chapter 28, this is more, again, dealing with these numbered treaties and things like that. And she starts her chapter in an interesting way, because she warns us about this term Aboriginal law. And I thought it was relevant to include this here, because I always have students in my classes who are interested in going to law school someday or working in the law field, the field of law in some capacity, or even political science, where this becomes very relevant as well. And then they hear this term Aboriginal law and they get all excited because they think they can actually go in and specialize in Aboriginal law, and this will help them help Indigenous people. And she warns us that that term is not actually a study of Indigenous legal traditions. It's more about how the Canadian state manages its relationship with Indigenous peoples. So she actually comes out and says it's all about a colonial nation claiming its claim to sovereignty. So what we saw with UNDRIP, right, it was very much Canada saying, no, we are sovereign, we get to decide. These Indigenous people have no kind of right to tell us what to do. In a nutshell is what is going on. And she says it's couched in liberal terms of respect and rights. And again, here I can't start telling students who to vote for and what parties to support. So when we say liberal here, it's not so much about the Liberal Party itself, but just this kind of generalized liberal attitude that, oh yes, Canada is good and respectful and honors people's rights. And so they say that, but then what they actually do is a whole other thing. And that doesn't matter who is in power at the time, whether it's conservatives or liberals, it's pretty much the same thing. So, in terms of what they say and what they do. So if we compare, so Vowell goes through this exercise of looking, okay, so these older treaties, numbered treaties, what we call the historic treaties, they would have an overt clause, like I said before: surrender, cede, release, yield, right? So basically, you're giving up your land and we're going to use it. It's ours now. That's what those treaties were saying. And as I've mentioned, they didn't always say this overtly to people. They would couch it in a lot of pretty language about how people would get to keep hunting and do the same thing their ancestors have been doing for millennia, and everything's fine, it's all good. But what was actually written wasn't said often was this. And in the very first week, when we looked at Concordia's land acknowledgement, and a lot of people were confused by that word unceded. Well, when you look at here, for example, there are no treaties here where we live and work in the Jojage or Montreal area. So people will see this is unceded land versus a place where there's actually been a treaty. So this was a part of these historic or numbered treaties. But then she goes, okay, so today, when the government wants to come to an agreement with the local, mostly First Nations, when we're talking about treaties, there haven't really been treaties involving Inuit people. There have been agreements, contemporary agreements. Métis, not so much. It's mostly First Nations peoples that we're talking about here. So she shows an example of a contemporary clause and a contemporary agreement that's kind of like a treaty, okay? And here she gives us a specific example from the Yukon Northern Affairs Program Devolution Transfer Agreement. So it's kind of like a treaty, they're just not calling it a treaty. It's an agreement between the government and First Nation. So they start out again like this thing, oh, everything's good, everything's fine. Nothing in this agreement shall be construed so as to abrogate or derogate from the protection provided for existing Aboriginal or treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada by the recognition and affirmation of those rights in Section 35 of the Constitutional Act. 1982. Now this is she didn't write this, right? She's quoting this agreement, and it sounds like, what the hell are they talking about, right? It's all legalese, and they're using the word Aboriginal, which has fallen out of favor. This is from this is an older thing. So what they're saying here is that this agreement will not go against the treaty rights of the people in question, of the Indigenous people in question, because these treaty rights are recognized in the Constitution Act of 1982. And so this agreement that the government is making with local First Nations, in this case, in this agreement, they're coming out and saying, there's nothing in this agreement that goes against your treaty rights. These are guaranteed, these are recognized. Sounds good, right? But it then goes on to say, notwithstanding, and I don't know if you know what notwithstanding means, but it's a way of saying, screw that, okay? It's a way of saying, oh yeah, we said this, but. So that's what notwithstanding kind of is, it's but, right? So notwithstanding what we just saw in the previous slide that said that treaty rights were going to be respected, in this agreement, the parties agree that any person who holds or acquires any title, right, or interest shall continue to be entitled to the quiet enjoyment of their said title, right, or interest without risk of a claim, legal or otherwise, by the First Nation based on any existing Aboriginal or treaty right to the said lands. And this is all, quotes, right? So basically what they're saying is that this agreement recognizes your treaty rights, but you can't actually act on those treaty rights. All right, so they really want people who buy property in this area to kind of feel like they own it, right? So like Vowell kind of paraphrases this and says, you aren't giving up any Aboriginal, and she's using the word they're using, right? She doesn't actually agree with using Aboriginal, as we saw in chapter 1. You aren't giving up any Aboriginal or treaty rights, but you agree never ever to exercise or claim those rights once you sign this agreement. So it's kind of like, it kind of nullifies effectively those rights. So to paraphrase, and this is my paraphrase, Canada is covering its butt so that non-Indigenous people who own land or think they own it don't have to worry about having it taken away. So it's problematic because, again, like when she says earlier that these are couched in kind of nice, happy, liberal language about rights and respect, well, they're not acting on it. So that's a problem, and that's something that you see a lot. And if you go into law and you start kind of picking these things, it's like mind numbing. I can't imagine myself doing it, so I'm happy that some people read it and tell me about it. Because I can't stand dealing with legalese. So again, we have this clash of worldviews here. So the Canadian imperative, the drive, is that treaties and agreements resolve the issue forever, right? So we sign it and we're good. Whereas, and again, I'm repeating myself here, but it's really important to re-emphasize this. The Indigenous imperative or drive is that treaties are meant to evolve and be revisited. So, and Vowell states it, right? A treaty is an ongoing relationship. We saw this in chapter 27 last week. We're seeing it again here. That is still there. So she ends this chapter by kind of going, okay, but so then why do some people sign these agreements if they're problematic? Well, it's a tough dilemma, right? Because of centuries of colonization, and we haven't talked about this much yet, but you might have seen things on the news sometimes or learned in other courses that there's a lot of poverty in Indigenous communities, whether it's First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. A lot of poverty, because people have been displaced from their lands a lot of the time. So, sometimes entire communities have been moved, and their cultures were adapted to their environments, so that if you move people, then they don't have access to their traditional lands where they could, depending on where they were, either grow crops further here in the south or in the north, hunt and fish. So you're keeping people from practicing their traditional way of life, but then because of racism, you're discriminating against them so that they don't have the same access to higher education and gainful employment as everybody else. So it's kind of putting people between a rock and a hard place. So in a lot of communities, you have a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment, plus people can't always access their traditional ways of getting food. And then you have, again, we've touched on residential schools and things like that a little bit, but all these assimilation tactics that we'll talk more about, with the Indian Act, things like that, residential schools, the 60s scoop, have caused much multi-generational trauma. So in communities, you have a lot of issues with domestic violence, intoxication, and I know it all sounds very negative, and these are kind of factual things, and I don't want to take away from the resilience that Indigenous people everywhere show. Life in these communities can be hard, but there's some beautiful things as well, and I do want to always emphasize that people aren't poor victims that need to be saved, okay? But we do need to recognize that there are a lot of issues in these communities directly caused by all this stuff. Centuries of colonization. So sometimes there's an immediate cash flow available through these agreements in situations where money is desperately needed to improve housing, because you have all these houses that are moldy, and sometimes families of 14 people living in a small house because there's not enough of them. Decrepit hospitals and schools. Things like that. So just safe places for children to play. I mean, kids need to play. That's how the kid's brain develops, is through play. If you don't have safe playgrounds, all these things. So if you're in a situation, and if you've been poor, or if you are poor, you might know this just from, now I've experienced this, where you're like, in the longer term, this deal you're making with the devil isn't going to be good for you, but right now you need to eat. And you're making the most immediate decision that you can make that is going to fill an immediate need. So sometimes that happens, and that can lead people to sign agreements, even if they know it's bad, because they're signing away the lands of future generations. Some of you picked up on that in previous reading questions, where you're like, yeah, there's this idea of the 7 generations, right? Always making decisions, thinking about the next 7 generations. And when people sign away their lands, often that's what the criticism is amongst people in these communities. Like, we're signing away what should be going to the next generations. So, but sometimes they have to choose between taking this big cash flow from these agreements or risk losing everything, because going through the Canadian courts hardly ever turns out in their favor. So sometimes it's like they're not happy about it, but they sign because at least they're getting something, because the government will go right in and steal everything anyway if they don't sign. So it's kind of really hard. If somebody comes and says, I'm going to take your house, and you can agree that I'll take your house, and I'm going to give you, like, I don't know, $1,000 or $10,000 or something, which is nowhere near the worth of that house, obviously, right? But then you're like, but then they say, well, if you don't sign, we're going to take it anyway, and then you'll be left with nothing. This is the dilemma that a lot of communities face. But I wanted to highlight this again to talk about that resilience, because this gives me goosebumps every time I read it, you know? Because she questions that, why do people sign? But then sometimes you go to court, sometimes you negotiate, sometimes you block roads, but you never ever truly accept you are signing away your rights. Indigenous peoples have to do this on paper sometimes because that is what required to survive. So as we just said, sometimes it's like it's this or it's lose everything, right? So they'll sign. But in our hearts, we know damn well this is not going to stop us in the future from exercising those rights. And to me, that speaks so much about that resilience, that kind of like, okay, we'll do what we need to do to survive another day, but you just wait till tomorrow, right? Because we're still going to be here and we're still going to fight. So I had to kind of point that out. And this leads us to our film this week. So, you know, you'll see in the reading assignment when you look at it, if you haven't already, there are a couple of little questions based on chapter 28, which we just did an overview of. And then there's a film to watch. And it's a little long. It's almost 90 minutes, but I promise you that it's worth it. And I invite you to watch this with, you know, people at home. It's educational, but I think I think it'll keep your attention, is what I'm saying. You can break it up if you need to, but I really encourage you to watch the whole thing, because I think this is a film that everybody living in Canada needs to be aware of. So I want to tell you a little bit about Alanis Obomsawin, who is the director and filmmaker of Trick or Treaty. And she's an Abenaki filmmaker based in Odanak. She was born in Vermont or New Hampshire, I think it was, but her family is from Odanak, Quebec, which is not that far. It's only 2.5, 3 hours north of Montreal. She's a legend. This woman's like, she's almost 90 and she's still making films. She's made dozens of films, I think over 50 films in her life. Probably more. And if you click on that link when you're looking at the slides on your own, you can go to it'll take you to the NFB website where there's a list of all her films. Okay, they're all there. She's received many awards and honors for her films, and she came to Vanier last year, 2020, during early March 2020, just before the lockdown, during International Women's Week, and I got to shake her hand. Oh my god. It's a fangirl moment. So, and that's her right there. So Trick or Treaty, with a question mark. So this film, just to give you an overview of what you're going to learn, it shows how Treaty 9, so one of those numbered treaties that Chelsea Vowell talks about, was more of a trick than a treaty. So there's the play on words of the film. And they'll talk to some Cree people from the First Nation in question in that treaty, as well as a non-Indigenous lawyer, who kind of look in and they dig and they kind of document how colonial powers were tricked people into signing this treaty, and they're moved to make more and more people aware of this. But what's interesting too is that it's about treaty. It's about this treaty, right? But it puts this struggle for acknowledgement of actual treaty rights in context of wider struggles. So this film was made in 2012, 2013. It was filmed throughout 2012. And what was going on at the time, so you had the Idle No More, and these are all links to places you can go learn more if you'd like. So the Idle No More movement, which still exists, started around that time, which was a nationwide movement for the recognition of Indigenous rights. And Teresa Spence, who at the time was the chief of a community called Attawapiskat, this is on the west coast, the Ontario side of Hudson Bay, or James Bay. It was a bit further south. And at the time, this First Nation, they were having an epidemic of youth suicide, just all kinds of problems, and they were going on emergency, what's that term? Emergency alerts, like emergency crisis situation. There's a term for that. State of emergency. State of emergency. There, that's the word I was looking for. And as chief, she wanted to talk to Stephen Harper, who was our PM at the time, our prime minister, and she went on a hunger strike in Ottawa. And so and she refused to eat. She had some broth, or so it was like a liquid fast. But until he would talk to her, and he never did. So, anyways. So that was going on so this is documented in the film as well. And the journey of Nishiu, which we have to talk about at some point because, most of you are young, you're in your late teens, 17, 18, 19, 20. Not all of you, right? But that's the average age of most of our students at Vanier. And the folks who initiated the journey of Nishiu were youth. So close to your age, some even younger. And they walked from a community on the east coast, on the Quebec side of Hudson Bay, Magusten. And they walked, this is like maybe 1,300 kilometers, all the way down to Ottawa to meet with the Prime Minister, to advocate for Indigenous rights in support of Idle No More and in support of Teresa Spence. And they walked, and it was winter. They left at the end of January. And I've lived up there. It gets to minus 40, minus 50 at this time of year, okay? So they walked, through their ancestral walking trails, snowshoes and stuff like that. They had an elder who guided them. And at every community that they would go through, because there's a whole bunch of First Nations communities, mostly Cree up there, and then on the way down through Anishinaabe territory, more youth would join them. And by the way, when they got to Ottawa, Stephen Harper knew they were coming. There was no way not to know they were coming, but he went to the Toronto Zoo instead to greet some pandas that had been donated from China. Yeah. So anyway, there's a lot of this, and when you're watching the film, so you have some questions in this week's reading questions that are specific to the film that will help you make connections with what you've been reading about treaties. But this will come back in other topics. We're going to refer back to this film. So I'd really like you to pay attention to a few things, observe a few things. I said it in the reading assignment too. Take some notes, things that stand out that you'll be able to refer to later on without necessarily having to go rewatch the film all over again. Observe the important roles of women and youth in Indigenous rights movements. I'm not going to say much more than that, but it's really kind of important to recognize that. Idle No More, for example, was created by women, 4 women, 3 of them First Nations, I think, and 1 of them non-Indigenous. I think they were all First Nations. I might be wrong. Maybe one was Métis. They were all three of them were Indigenous. Let's say that. Youth. Okay, so we just talked about the journey of Nishiu. Youth have a very big role, and you'll see a lot of footage from actual footage from rallies. There are a bunch of people I know in there, by the way, which is always pretty cool. And just how much they're valued in their communities. Also, at one point they talk as well, some of the people in the film talk about the importance of non-Indigenous supporters. So keep that into consideration as well, especially since some of you have already shown that you'd like to go forth in life and be a better ally to Indigenous people. And some of the symbolism that is present at rallies and marches, there's a lot of symbolism from different Indigenous cultures that comes out. And just kind of watch some of this and just kind of take note of that. And finally, of course, any connections that you can make with the stuff that Vowell talks about in chapters 27 and 28 that are about treaties. So I hope that you enjoy this week's material. It might seem, usually I try to balance some of the more kind of heady stuff and learning about this kind of more political, socio-political stuff with some stuff about learning about, say, Haudenosaunee culture. But this week I really felt this was important to focus on. We're going to go back to that balance in future weeks, but this week we're going to look at this, and there's a fun film to watch. It really is a pleasant film to watch, so I encourage you to watch the whole thing and not just stop after you got the answers that you're looking for. And if you have any questions about this, let me know.